If you want to pass the GED Social Studies exam, you need to know what to study. When you have an understanding of what will be on the test, you can study more effectively. In this video, I'll start to lay out exactly what you need to do so that you can score 145 and pass the GED Social Studies exam. This will be the first video in a three-part series about the GED Social Studies exam. In this first video, we'll be going over what are called the Social Studies practices, or what you need to be able to do to pass the test. The two following videos will cover the social studies content, or what you'll need to know on the social studies test. Having a better idea of what you'll need to know and do on the test will help you focus your efforts on the best resources for you. First, we'll talk about what you won't be asked to do on this test, and then we'll talk about exactly what you can practice so that you'll be ready to pass the GED Social Studies exam. A lot of us may have struggled through social studies and history classes in school because we had teachers who really focused on names, dates, and memorization. Luckily for you, the GED Social Studies exam is not that kind of test. Let me repeat, you do not need to memorize any names or dates to pass this test. This test, just like the GED RLA exam, is really one that focuses on your ability as a reader and a thinker. And this one specifically focuses on your ability to read and analyze texts that are about history, economics, civics, and geography. So in theory, there's really nothing that you need to learn or memorize to do well on this test. However, it's really helpful if you are comfortable with the topics that appear in the readings on the tests. That way you already have a handle on the big ideas that will appear in those readings as well as the vocabulary that will be used. We'll talk more about those topics that will appear in the next two videos, but today we're just going to talk about those important skills that you'll need for every reading, no matter the topic. I hope that if you've watched my series about how to pass the GED RLA exam and even the series about how to pass the GED math exam, that some of these skills will sound really familiar. In fact, I always recommend to my students that they start with the GED RLA and math exams because you can recycle a lot of the skills that you learned for those tests on the GED Science and Social Studies exams. There are three big skills that you'll need to pass this one. Number one, the first big skill is being able to read for meaning in social studies. We talked about reading for meaning when we discussed the RLA exam. This means that you need to be able to read a short passage from a primary or secondary source and identify the main idea of the passage, as well as make inferences about what is being implied by the passage. Primary sources are usually letters or speeches that are written by somebody who was alive during that time period. These passages can be challenging to read because they often contain language that we consider to be a little old-fashioned. A lot of the primary sources that are used on this test are now 200 or even 300 years old. It's worth taking some time to practice reading these kinds of primary sources so that you feel comfortable when you see them on the test. You also need to be able to identify the common social studies vocabulary that will appear in those passages. This is where that review of social studies content that appears can be helpful, but it's also useful if you can use context clues to identify what a word means in a passage. Number two, the second big skill on this exam is being able to analyze events and arguments in social studies. This is also super similar to what we talked about for the RLA exam. You need to be able to identify how an author uses language and rhetorical devices to strengthen their argument, as well as whether an author has used sufficient and credible evidence to support their argument. You'll need to be able to distinguish between fact and opinion, and you'll need to be able to identify propaganda and bias in writing. Often, those two are characterized by the use of the type of logical fallacies we discussed in the video about writing your extended response. And just like in the extended response, you'll need to be able to compare two passages in order to identify the strengths of different arguments. And finally, number three, the third big skill that you need to pass the GED Social Studies exam is being able to use math skills in order to interpret data. You'll need to be able to use data that's presented visually, including on graphs, maps, charts, and tables. Not only do you need to be able to read those visual representations, you'll also need to be able to use the information that they contain in order to make inferences and predictions about the data. You need to understand the relationship between sets of data, including being able to identify a dependent and independent variable. As a tip, usually the independent variable is represented along the horizontal or x-axis of a graph, and the dependent variable is represented along the vertical or y-axis of the graph. An example of this would be a graph showing a population of a city over a period of 100 years. In this case, population is the dependent variable because it changes over time as conditions change. The time that passes is not impacted by the changing of the population, so that's the independent variable. However, another example would be the amount of food that's needed as a population grows. In this case, each additional person who moves to a location increases the amount of food that's needed. So in this case, the amount of food needed is dependent on the size of the population. You might be asked to identify the graph that accurately represents a described scenario. You'll also need to be able to identify cause and effect, as well as be able to distinguish between causation and correlation. A classic example of correlation not being the same as causation is that a lot of people who are diagnosed with lung cancer carry around lighters in their pockets. However, the lighters don't cause the lung cancer. Those conditions are simply correlated. Rather, it's smoking cigarettes that causes both the carrying of the lighters and the lung cancer. You need to evaluate data carefully to be able to identify whether variables are simply correlated or whether there might be a causal relationship. And finally, in this section, you'll need to be able to find the mean, the median, the mode, and the range of data sets. We discussed how to find those in the math series, which I will link above. You are allowed to use a calculator on this test, and if you are taking the test in person at a testing center, you are able to bring a specific calculator, the TI-30XS Multiview, which will also be available digitally on screen. If you're taking the test remotely from home, you will have to use the on-screen version. However, I do recommend that you practice using the actual calculator ahead of time so that you're comfortable with the layouts and the special buttons. I'll link that below if you'd like to check it out. They're usually pretty affordable, usually only $15 or $16. Okay, so those are the 3 big social studies practice skills that you will need to approach this test no matter what the passages are about. The best way to improve your social studies practice skills is by practicing the types of questions that will appear on the test. You can look at the example problems provided in the social studies section of the GED.com site, and I'll also link to the Kaplan GED Prep Manual. It has some more specific advice about how to approach primary source documents, as well as explanations for why certain answers are correct. You can also use whatever GED Prep Manual your local library has available to borrow. On this channel, I make videos about how to study more effectively so that you can achieve your goals. In the coming weeks, I'll be discussing the social studies content that appears on this exam, including US history, civics and government, economics, and geography. So please subscribe if you'd like to learn more. You can also check out this video about how to start studying for the GED exams. If this video was helpful to you, please press the like button so that YouTube knows to share it with other studiers. Thanks as always for watching, and until next time, happy studying.